What if I told you that the fear you've carried your entire life, that voice that whispers, "You're not ready, it's too dangerous. What if you fail?" isn't actually yours? What if everything you've been taught about fear being necessary for survival is one of the greatest deceptions humanity has ever accepted? Right now, as you're watching this, millions of people around the world are making decisions not based on what their soul truly desires, but on what their programmed fear tells them is safe. They're choosing jobs that drain their spirit because fear says, at least it's secure. They're staying in relationships that no longer serve them because fear whispers, what if you end up alone? They're keeping their dreams locked away in the vault of someday because fear has convinced them they're not worthy, not ready, not enough. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Has this ever happened to you? You know exactly what you want to do. You can feel it calling to your very soul. But the moment you consider taking action, a familiar weight settles in your chest. Your mind floods with 1,000 reasons why you shouldn't, couldn't, mustn't. That's not intuition speaking. That's inherited programming, ancient patterns passed down through generations of souls who forgot their true divine nature. Here's what might shock you. Living without fear isn't a fantasy reserved for enlightened masters or spiritual saints. It's actually the natural state of every human soul. Fear, as we know it, is not instinct. It's learned behavior, cultural conditioning that has been repeated for so many centuries that we've mistaken it for truth. We've been taught that fear protects us, keeps us safe, helps us make wise decisions. But what if fear isn't your guardian angel? What if it's actually the prison guard keeping you from the life you were meant to live? Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to discover might fundamentally shift how you see every decision you've ever made out of fear. You see, when spiritual teachers throughout history spoke of being born again or experiencing spiritual awakening, they weren't talking about joining a religion. They were pointing to this exact moment when a soul remembers its true nature and stops obeying the false authority of inherited fear. The soul that has remembered who it truly is doesn't tremble at uncertainty. It doesn't need guarantees before taking action. It doesn't seek permission from a world that has forgotten its own divine nature. This isn't recklessness or naive optimism. This is alignment with a deeper truth that exists beyond the programming of collective human consciousness. Every great breakthrough in human history, every leap of faith that changed the world, every moment of authentic love and creation happened when someone chose to act from soul-knowing rather than fear-thinking. And that same capacity lives within you right now, waiting to be activated, waiting for you to remember that the voice of fear and the voice of your authentic self are not the same voice. What you're about to learn will show you exactly how this transformation happens, how ancient programming dissolves when exposed to conscious awareness, and how you can begin living from that place of fearless authenticity that is your birthright. Because once you understand the true nature of fear, if you're ready to explore life beyond inherited fears, subscribing gives you access to tools for real transformation. This content is for people who want depth, not just surface-level motivation. The moment you begin to see yourself differently, everything shifts. It's not about positive thinking or pretending your challenges don't exist. It's about recognizing that you've been living as a character in a story someone else wrote for you, when you were always meant to be the author of your own journey. This transformation happens when you stop identifying with the voice that says, "I'm not qualified," and start speaking from the deeper knowing that whispers, "I belong here." Think about the last time you made a decision from fear versus the last time you acted from genuine inner guidance. Can you feel the difference? When fear drives your choices, there's always that underlying tension, that constant vigilance, that exhausting need to control every outcome. But when you move from that authentic place within yourself, even if the path isn't clear, there's a quality of ease that emerges. Your breathing deepens, your shoulders relax, and somehow the world seems to collaborate with your intentions rather than resist them. This isn't mystical thinking, it's practical psychology. When you operate from elevated consciousness, you literally perceive different possibilities than when you're trapped in survival mode. The same situation that once triggered panic now becomes an opportunity for growth. The conversation that used to make you defensive becomes a chance for deeper connection. The uncertainty that kept you awake at night transforms into exciting potential. What's fascinating is how this inner shift affects everything around you, without you having to force anything external to change. Your relationships begin to soften because you're no longer approaching people from a place of need or defense. Your body starts responding differently to stress because you're not constantly flooding it with fight or flight chemicals. Your words carry a different weight because they're coming from authenticity rather than fear-based reactions. People notice this transformation even when they can't put their finger on what's different about you. They might say things like, "You seem more confident," or "There's something peaceful about your energy." But what they're really sensing is someone who has stopped living as a victim of circumstances and started operating as a conscious creator of their experience. The hidden truth is that this peaceful state isn't something you achieve through years of meditation or spiritual practice, though those can certainly help. It's actually your natural state once you remove the layers of conditioning that convinced you otherwise. It's like cleaning dust off a window. The light was always there, you just couldn't see it clearly. Now, I want to go even deeper into this revelation because understanding the mechanics of how fear actually operates in your system is crucial for breaking free from its influence. Most people spend their entire lives trying to manage their fears, rather than recognizing that fear itself is often based on outdated information, inherited beliefs, and programming that was never even yours to begin with. When you truly grasp how this programming was installed and how it continues to run your life behind the scenes, you'll see exactly why some people seem to move through the world with such ease while others struggle with the same basic decisions day after day. Write in the comments, "I'm ready to see the truth." Fear is perhaps the most sophisticated con artist you'll ever encounter. It doesn't show up wearing a villain's mask or announcing itself with dramatic music. Instead, it arrives dressed as your most trusted advisor, speaking in the voice of reason, wearing the costume of wisdom. It sits in boardrooms disguised as market analysis, and whispers in bedrooms disguised as being realistic about your limitations. This masterful impersonator has perfected the art of sounding exactly like the voice of maturity. When you're about to take a leap towards something that genuinely excites you, fear steps in with its clipboard of concerns, speaking in that familiar parental tone that says, "Now let's be sensible about this." It presents spreadsheets of everything that could go wrong, statistics about failure rates, and compelling arguments about why timing isn't quite right yet. The brilliance of this disguise is that it makes you feel responsible and intelligent for listening to it. You walk away from opportunities thinking you've made a wise, measured decision when what actually happened is you've been talked out of your own expansion by an internal committee that exists solely to keep you exactly where you are. Here's the revelation that changes everything. The part of you that genuinely needs protection isn't the part that's capable of creating the life you desire. Your deepest self, your authentic essence, the part of you that gets excited about possibilities and feels called toward growth, that part is actually indestructible. It can't be diminished by failure, can't be damaged by criticism, and can't be destroyed by taking the wrong path. What needs Protection is the constructed identity you've built over years of trying to fit in, avoid rejection, and meet other people's expectations. This manufactured version of yourself is indeed fragile because it's based on external validation and circumstances beyond your control. But this isn't who you really are. It's just a character you've been playing so long you forgot it was a role. The fascinating thing about this constructed self is how it positions itself as your protector, while actually functioning as your prison warden. It promises to keep you safe by ensuring you never have to face uncertainty, never risk disappointment, never experience the vulnerability that comes with authentic living. But what it's really doing is preventing you from accessing the very experiences that would reveal your true strength and resilience. Think about the decisions you've avoided for your own good, the conversations you didn't have because they might be uncomfortable, the creative projects you shelved because they weren't guaranteed to succeed, the relationships you didn't pursue because rejection felt too risky. In each case, what felt like self-protection was actually self-imprisonment. The transformation happens when you recognize that your deepest self doesn't need this kind of protection because it can't actually be harmed by external circumstances. Failure doesn't diminish it, criticism doesn't wound it, and uncertainty doesn't threaten it. This part of you is like water. It adapts to any container but maintains its essential nature regardless of external conditions. The people who subscribe here recognize that freedom isn't about managing fear better. It's about remembering who you were before fear took over. If that's your journey, subscribe to continue the conversation. Once you understand this distinction between your indestructible essence and your protective persona, you can begin to see how much energy you've been wasting on defending something that was never really you to begin with. The relief that comes with this realization is immediate and profound. Now, recognizing these patterns is just the beginning, because fear has been running sophisticated programs in your subconscious for years, creating automatic responses that bypass your conscious awareness entirely. Write in the comments, "I see the disguise now." These automatic responses run so deep that most people never question them. Every time you choose the safe option over the option that genuinely calls to you, you're essentially casting a vote of no confidence in the fundamental nature of existence itself. You're declaring, without even realizing it, that the universe is fundamentally hostile, that life is more likely to punish than reward, that you exist in a reality where your authentic desires are dangerous luxuries you can't afford. This goes far beyond simple decision-making. This is about your core relationship with existence itself. When fear drives your choices, you're operating from a baseline assumption that you're alone in a threatening world, that you have to fight for everything good that comes into your life, and that relaxing your vigilance for even a moment will result in loss, rejection, or failure. But here's where this gets really interesting. If you trace this pattern back to its origin, you'll discover something remarkable. None of these beliefs were originally yours. They were absorbed, inherited, and programmed into your system during your most impressionable years by people who were operating from their own inherited fears. Your grandmother's anxiety about money during the Depression became your father's compulsive saving habits, which became your fear of spending money on anything that brings you joy. The revelation that changes everything is understanding that fear operates like learned behavior, not like an immutable characteristic. Just as you learn to ride a bike, speak a language, or navigate social situations, you learn to be afraid of uncertainty, rejection, failure, and authenticity. And here's the beautiful truth. Anything that was learned can be unlearned. The key distinction that most people miss is the difference between fear and genuine wisdom. Wisdom doesn't make you smaller. It helps you navigate expansion more skillfully. Wisdom doesn't paralyze you with endless what-if scenarios. It gives you clarity about timing and approach. Wisdom doesn't whisper, "You're not ready," for years on end. It helps you prepare efficiently and then encourages you to move forward. When you tune in to actual wisdom, you'll notice it has a completely different quality than fear. Wisdom feels spacious, even when it's cautioning patience. Fear feels contracted, even when it's disguised as planning. Wisdom offers guidance that increases your sense of personal power. Fear offers protection that diminishes your sense of personal agency. The transformation begins when you start questioning the source of your hesitation. Is this genuine wisdom, suggesting a better approach, or is this inherited programming trying to keep me exactly where I am? Is this insight helping me move forward more skillfully, or is this conditioning trying to convince me that forward movement itself is dangerous? Once you develop this ability to distinguish between authentic guidance and programmed responses, you'll be amazed at how many decisions you've been making from outdated information that was never even accurate in the first place. Now, understanding the mechanics of inherited programming is crucial because these patterns didn't just appear randomly in your life. Write in the comments, "I'm ready to unlearn." These invisible barriers become so familiar that you stop noticing them. You've constructed an entire identity around what you can't do, what's not for you, what's too risky or too late. The most insidious part is how reasonable these limitations sound. They're not dramatic declarations of defeat. They're quiet, sensible-sounding conclusions that gradually shrink your world without you realizing it's happening. You develop elaborate justifications for why you're not pursuing what genuinely excites you. You become an expert at explaining why now isn't the right time, why you need more preparation, why other people are better suited for the opportunities that call to you. These explanations sound so logical that even you believe them, not recognizing that you're essentially building a prison out of postponement and self-doubt. What's happening behind the scenes is that you're training yourself to live in a perpetual state of almost ready to start that project, almost confident enough to have that conversation, almost prepared to take that leap. This almost becomes your permanent address, a comfortable middle ground where you never have to face the vulnerability of actually showing up fully in your own life. But here's what most people don't understand about human nature. Your authentic self cannot be permanently suppressed. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You can do it for a while, but it requires constant effort, and eventually your arms get tired. The energy it takes to keep your true desires submerged becomes exhausting, and that exhaustion manifests in unexpected ways. You might find yourself feeling inexplicably restless during periods when your life looks perfectly fine from the outside. You might experience a vague sense of dissatisfaction that you can't quite put your finger on. You might catch yourself scrolling through social media, watching other people live the kind of life you've convinced yourself isn't possible for you, feeling both envious and defeated without understanding why. This restlessness isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. It's actually a sign that something's right with you. It's your authentic self refusing to accept the limitations you've imposed. It's your deepest wisdom rejecting the story that you're meant to live a small, safe, predictable existence. It's your soul essentially saying, "I didn't come here to hide." The awakening happens differently for everyone, but it always happens. Sometimes it's triggered by a crisis that shatters your illusion of control. Sometimes it emerges through success that leaves you feeling surprisingly empty. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet but persistent voice that refuses to be silenced, asking questions like, "Is this really all there? Or what if I'm capable of more than I've allowed myself to imagine?" When this awakening begins, you'll notice that the old excuses start losing their power over you. The voice that used to convince you to wait just a little longer starts sounding less like wisdom and more like stalling. The reasons that used to feel so compelling start feeling like elaborate ways of avoiding the very experiences that would help you grow. This is where the real transformation becomes possible, because once you recognize that your limitations were self-imposed, you can begin the process of consciously choosing which ones to keep and which ones to release. Write in the comments, "I feel the awakening." The moment fear takes residence in your consciousness, it creates a frequency that's incompatible with the extraordinary. It's like trying to tune into a radio station while standing next to an electrical interference. The signal gets scrambled, distorted, reduced to static. Fear operates on a wavelength that blocks your ability to perceive and act upon the opportunities that could transform your entire trajectory. Consider those moments when you were completely absorbed in something you loved, when time seemed to disappear and solutions appeared effortlessly. In those states, you weren't monitoring potential threats or calculating risks. You were fully present, completely aligned with what you were doing. That alignment is where breakthrough moments happen, where creative insights emerge, where the impossible becomes inevitable. But fear pulls you out of that state instantly. The moment you start wondering, what if this doesn't work? Or what will people think? You've shifted from the frequency of possibility to the frequency of limitation. You've moved from being open to receive to being closed off by protection. It's not that the opportunities disappear, they're still there, but you're no longer able to perceive them clearly or act upon them confidently. This interference happens so subtly that most people don't realize they're living in a state of constant signal disruption. They wonder why good things seem to happen to other people, why opportunities seem to pass them by, why their efforts don't yield the results they hope for. What they don't recognize is that they're unconsciously broadcasting a frequency of doubt, limitation, and self-protection that repels the very experiences they claim to want. The tragedy isn't just in what fear prevents you from gaining. It's in what it actively steals from you. Every conversation you don't start because you might be rejected. Every creative project you don't begin because it might not be perfect. Every relationship you don't pursue because you might get hurt. Every dream you postpone because you might fail. These aren't just missed opportunities. They're pieces of your authentic life that get permanently erased from your experience. Fear operates like a master thief, working in broad daylight. It doesn't break down doors or shatter windows. It simply convinces you to hand over your keys. It persuades you that you're being wise and responsible when you choose the smaller option, the safer path, the more predictable outcome. By the time you realize what's been taken, years have passed, and you find yourself looking back at a life half-lived. The most insidious theft is how fear robs you of the joy of being yourself. It convinces you that your authentic desires are somehow selfish, unrealistic, or inappropriate. It trains you to edit yourself before you speak, to shrink yourself before you enter rooms, to apologize for taking up space before anyone even suggests you shouldn't. But here's the revolutionary truth that changes everything. Fear only has the power you give it. It's not an external force imposing limitations on your life. It's an internal agreement you can choose to revoke at any moment. Now, understanding how to actually dissolve these patterns and step into a completely different way of operating requires looking at the precise mechanics of how fear gets established in your system and how it perpetuates itself through unconscious habits. Write in the comments, "Fear stole from me too." The root of all fear lies in a fundamental case of mistaken identity. The moment you begin to see yourself as this body, this history, this collection of experiences and memories, you've stepped into an illusion that immediately creates vulnerability. You start believing you're a separate entity navigating a hostile world, disconnected from any larger intelligence or support system. This isn't philosophical theory. This is the actual mechanism behind why some people move through life with ease, while others struggle with basic decisions. When you identify completely with your physical form and personal story, you naturally become afraid because bodies can be hurt, histories can be painful, and individual stories often feel fragile and temporary. But what if your identity has been based on the wrong information? What if you've been trying to protect something that was never actually at risk? The part of you that worries about failure, rejection, and loss is operating from the assumption that you are fundamentally alone and vulnerable. But the part of you that feels called toward growth, creativity, and authentic expression knows something different. It knows you're connected to something much larger than your individual circumstances. This connection isn't mystical or abstract. It's the difference between feeling like you're fighting the world versus feeling like you're collaborating with it. When you operate from separation, every interaction becomes potentially threatening. When you operate from connection, interactions become opportunities for mutual enrichment. Here's where this gets really practical. Fear literally feeds on the attention you give it. Every time you mentally rehearse what might go wrong, every conversation where you elaborate on your worries, every moment spent analyzing past failures to predict future disasters, you're essentially providing fuel for the very thing you want to eliminate. This creates a perverse feedback loop that most people never recognize. They think talking about their fears will help them process and release them, but what actually happens is they're strengthening the neural pathways associated with those fears. They're training their brain to become more efficient at generating fearful thoughts. The same thing happens when you try to protect yourself from fear through avoidance or control. Each defensive maneuver sends a message to your subconscious that fear is indeed something to be afraid of, that it has real power over your well-being. This is why people who spend enormous amounts of energy trying to manage their anxiety often find it getting worse rather than better. The transformation happens when you recognize that fear exists only in the attention you give it and the stories you tell yourself about it. It has no independent existence outside of your mental focus. This means you're not actually trapped by external circumstances. You're trapped by habitual patterns of attention and interpretation. Now, recognizing these patterns is just the beginning, because most people have been unconsciously strengthening fear-based thinking for so many years that it feels completely automatic and beyond their control. Write in the comments, "I see the feeding cycle." The most revealing thing about fear is what it actually wants from you. Fear doesn't care about your safety, your success, or your well-being. Fear has one primary agenda: keeping you exactly where you are. It will dress up this agenda in the language of protection and wisdom, but its real motivation is maintaining the status quo of your life, regardless of whether that status quo serves you. This is why fear becomes most vocal precisely when you're about to make a positive change. The moment you decide to start that business, have that difficult conversation, or pursue that opportunity that genuinely excites you, fear shows up with its most compelling arguments. It's not coincidence, it's strategy. Fear understands that growth is its kryptonite. When you expand beyond your familiar patterns, when you develop new capabilities and discover reserves of strength you didn't know you had, fear loses its grip on your decision-making process. A person who has successfully navigated uncertainty multiple times is much harder to convince that uncertainty is dangerous. Someone who has recovered from failure knows that failure isn't fatal. Fear simply cannot maintain its authority over someone who has repeatedly proven its warnings wrong. This is why the resistance you feel before taking meaningful action is often proportional to how transformative that action could be. The bigger the potential breakthrough, the louder fear gets in its final attempts to Maintain control. It's like a dictator facing a revolution. The more threatened it feels, the more desperate and dramatic its tactics become. Understanding this pattern changes everything about how you interpret your own hesitation. Instead of seeing resistance as a sign that you should stop, you can recognize it as confirmation that you're headed in a direction that will genuinely expand your life. The very presence of fear becomes evidence that you're approaching something significant. But here's where most people get stuck. They think overcoming fear means becoming fearless. They imagine they need to wait until the fear completely disappears before taking action. This approach keeps them perpetually waiting, because fear doesn't disappear through avoidance. It dissolves through replacement. You can't create a vacuum in consciousness. If you remove one thought pattern, something else must take its place. This is why positive thinking often fails. It tries to eliminate negative thoughts without providing a compelling alternative. But when you replace fear-based thinking with something more true, more expansive, and more aligned with who you actually are, the old patterns naturally fade away. The key is recognizing that fear is ultimately based on false information about your capabilities and the nature of reality itself. When you consistently choose thoughts and actions based on what you're actually capable of, rather than what you're afraid you might not be capable of, you begin to accumulate evidence that contradicts fear's fundamental premises. Now, developing this ability to consistently choose expansion over contraction requires understanding exactly how to interrupt the automatic patterns that have been running your life and replace them with conscious choices aligned with your authentic nature. Write in the comments, "I choose expansion." The deepest revelation about fear is realizing that the part of you capable of experiencing fear and the part of you that is your true essence are not the same part. There's a fundamental case of mistaken identity happening when you say, "I am afraid." What's actually happening is that a constructed version of yourself, built from past experiences and learned responses, is responding to a perceived threat. But your core being, your authentic self, remains untouched by these fluctuations. Think about this for a moment. There's a part of you that can observe your own fear. When you're anxious about something, there's an awareness that notices, "I'm feeling anxious right now." That awareness itself isn't anxious, it's simply observing the anxiety. This observer doesn't get swept away by the emotional storm. It watches the storm from a place of calm stability. This observer is who you really are. It's the part of you that remains constant while everything else in your life changes. Your body ages, your circumstances shift, your knowledge expands, your relationships evolve. But this witnessing awareness remains the same. This is your true self, and this true self has never been afraid of anything because it knows something the constructed self has forgotten. The constructed self lives in time, always worried about what might happen in the future or what went wrong in the past. It's built from memories of pain, expectations of pleasure, and strategies for avoiding discomfort. This version of you feels very real because you've been identifying with it for so long, but it's actually just a collection of learned responses and inherited patterns. Your authentic self exists beyond time. It doesn't need to protect itself because it recognizes its fundamental indestructibility. It doesn't fear change because it knows change only affects the surface level of existence. It doesn't worry about approval because it understands its worth isn't determined by external validation. The transformation happens when you learn to identify more with the observer than with what's being observed. Instead of saying, "I am afraid," you begin to notice, "There's some fear happening in my experience right now." This simple shift in perspective creates immediate space between you and the fear, and in that space you discover your freedom. When you operate from this observer perspective, decisions become much clearer because you're no longer trying to protect a fragile identity. You're not asking, "What if this doesn't work out for me?" You're asking, what wants to emerge through this situation? You're not wondering, what will people think of me? You're curious about, what's the most authentic response I can offer here? This isn't about suppressing or denying the fearful thoughts when they arise. It's about recognizing that these thoughts are just weather patterns moving through your consciousness, not fundamental truths about who you are or what you're capable of. Now, understanding this distinction intellectually is just the beginning, because actually living from this observer perspective in daily life requires developing new habits of attention and response that interrupt the automatic identification with fear-based thinking. Write in the comments, "Ion music of your entire existence." You don't wake up one day and decide to live in fear. It seeps in slowly, quietly, until it's so woven into the fabric of your daily experience that you mistake it for reality itself. It becomes the lens through which you interpret every situation, the filter that colors every interaction, the invisible force shaping decisions you don't even realize you're making. This atmospheric fear operates below the level of conscious awareness most of the time. You might not feel actively afraid, but you're constantly bracing for impact. You're perpetually scanning for potential problems, unconsciously editing your words before you speak them, automatically choosing the safer option, without even considering alternatives. It's like living with background anxiety that's become so familiar you've forgotten what peace feels like. The most dangerous aspect of this condition is how it masquerades as normal adult thinking. Society has convinced us that this hypervigilant state is just being responsible, mature, realistic about life's challenges. We call it being prepared, being smart, being careful. But what it really is exhausting. It's living in a state of chronic low-level stress that gradually erodes your sense of possibility and joy. When fear becomes your default operating system, your mind starts constructing elaborate scenarios about everything that could go wrong. You become an expert at imagining worst-case outcomes, building detailed mental models of failure, rejection, and disaster. You spend enormous amounts of mental energy planning for problems that haven't happened and likely never will, while simultaneously convincing yourself this is productive thinking. This mental habit creates a peculiar relationship with the future where you're always expecting something bad to be waiting for you just around the corner. Instead of approaching new situations with curiosity or excitement, you approach them with defensive strategies already in place. Instead of seeing opportunities, you see potential threats that need to be managed, controlled, or avoided entirely. The tragic irony is that this fearful thinking, which promises to protect you from pain and disappointment, actually creates exactly what it's trying to prevent. When you consistently expect problems, you unconsciously behave in ways that invite problems. When you assume people will reject you, you interact with them in ways that make rejection more likely. When you anticipate failure, you unconsciously sabotage your own efforts to avoid the disappointment of trying your best and falling short. This isn't mystical thinking, it's basic psychology. Your expectations shape your perceptions, which influence your actions, which create your results. If you're operating from a baseline assumption that life is dangerous and people are threats, you'll consistently create experiences that confirm those beliefs. Now, breaking free from this atmospheric fear requires understanding exactly how it maintains its grip on your consciousness and learning specific techniques to interrupt these automatic patterns before they spiral into full-blown anxiety or paralysis. Write in the comments, "Fear became my atmosphere." The language you use isn't just describing your reality, it's actively creating it. Every conversation becomes a reinforcement session for whatever dominates your inner landscape. When fear has taken residence in your heart, it doesn't stay quietly hidden there. It demands expression, insists on being heard, requires validation through your words. You'll find yourself gravitating toward conversations about what's going wrong in the world, what might go wrong in your life, what has gone wrong in the past. You become fluent in the vocabulary of limitation, speaking casually about scarcity, obstacles, and threats, as if they're the only elements that matter in any situation. Without realizing it, you've become a broadcaster of fear, transmitting its frequency to everyone around you. The devastating part is how this creates a feedback loop that most people never recognize. Each time you verbalize a worry, describe a threat, or elaborate on what you're afraid might happen, you're not just expressing fear, you're strengthening it. You're training your nervous system to be more sensitive to danger signals. You're programming your subconscious to notice and magnify exactly the kinds of experiences you're talking about. This is why people who constantly discuss their health problems tend to have more health problems. Why those who frequently talk about financial struggles continue to experience financial struggles. Why individuals who regularly describe relationship difficulties keep encountering relationship difficulties. It's not that talking about problems causes them, but the mental and emotional energy focused on problems creates a perceptual filter that makes problems more prominent and solutions less visible. When fear becomes the organizing principle of your existence, it starts making decisions for you that you don't even realize are being made. You structure your schedule around avoiding potential discomfort rather than pursuing genuine interests. You choose relationships based on safety rather than connection. You accept opportunities based on security rather than growth. Every choice gets filtered through the question, what's the safest option? Instead of, what's the most authentic option? This creates a life that looks functional from the outside, but feels hollow from the inside. You're going through the motions of living while being guided by a force that's fundamentally opposed to life itself. You might appear successful, busy, even happy to others, but internally you're operating from a constant state of subtle contraction, always holding back just a little, always keeping something in reserve, always preparing for the next potential disappointment. The saddest part is how this separates you from your own authentic desires and natural rhythms. You stop asking yourself what you actually want and start asking what you can safely have. You stop listening to your intuition and start following predetermined scripts about how to avoid problems. You end up living someone else's life, a life designed by fear rather than chosen by love. Now, recognizing these patterns is the crucial first step, but actually transforming them requires understanding the specific mechanics of how inherited programming gets passed down through generations and how to consciously interrupt these ancestral patterns. Write in the comments, I became fear's broadcaster. The fears that feel most personal to you often have the longest history. They didn't originate in your experience. They traveled through bloodlines, passed down like invisible heirlooms from parent to child, generation after generation. Your grandmother's fear of not having enough during the Great Depression became your mother's compulsive need to save everything, which became your own anxiety about spending money on anything that brings you joy. These inherited patterns are so subtle that you assume they're just part of your personality. You think you're naturally cautious with money, naturally worried about what others think, naturally uncomfortable with expressing emotions. But what if these aren't natural traits at all? What if they're learned responses that were absorbed so early and so consistently that they feel like they've always been part of who you are? The transmission happens in thousands of small moments. The way your father's face tightened whenever bills arrived in the mail. How your mother's Voice changed when she talked about certain family members, the conversations that stopped abruptly when you entered the room, the topics that were never discussed, the emotions that were never acknowledged, the dreams that were dismissed as impractical before they could even be fully formed. Children are incredibly sensitive to the emotional climate of their environment, even when nothing is explicitly said. You absorbed your family's relationship with risk, their beliefs about what was possible for people like you, their assumptions about how the world works and what you need to do to survive in it. None of this was malicious. They were simply passing on what they had received, operating from their own inherited programming without even realizing it. But the programming didn't stop with your family. Your culture, your educational system, your religious institutions all contributed their own layers of fear-based conditioning. You were taught that questioning authority is disrespectful, that trusting your own instincts is selfish, that wanting too much is greedy, that expressing your authentic self is somehow dangerous or inappropriate. Religious fear programming can be particularly deep because it comes wrapped in the language of love and salvation. You learn to fear your own desires as temptations, to see your body as a source of sin, to believe that a divine force is constantly monitoring your thoughts and actions, ready to punish any misstep. This creates a pervasive sense of being watched and judged that extends far beyond religious contexts, affecting how you show up in relationships, work situations, and even private moments with yourself. The devastating impact of this conditioning is that it makes fear feel holy, responsible, even necessary. You've been trained to see caution as wisdom, worry as love, and limitation as humility. Breaking free from these patterns feels like rebellion against everything you were taught was good and right and safe. Now, understanding how these generational patterns get established is crucial, because once you recognize that most of your fears weren't originally yours, you can begin the process of consciously choosing which beliefs to keep and which ones to release. Write in the comments, "I inherited fear too." The most empowering realization you can have about inherited fear is that you have the power to be the end of the line. You didn't choose to receive these patterns, but you can absolutely choose whether to pass them on. When you consciously decide to interrupt a cycle of fear that has been running through your family for generations, you're not just healing yourself, you're healing the entire lineage. This isn't metaphorical healing, it's energetic reality. When you stop operating from inherited anxiety about money, your children absorb a different frequency around abundance. When you stop making decisions from fear of judgment, you model a different relationship with authenticity. When you break the pattern of avoiding difficult emotions, you create space for future generations to feel and process their experiences more completely. The ripple effect works backward too. As you release patterns that weren't originally yours, something shifts in the family system that can actually influence how you perceive and relate to your parents and ancestors. It's as if you're returning to them the parts of their story that belong to survival mode rather than authentic choice, allowing you to see them more clearly and compassionately. But here's where this transformation often hits its biggest obstacle: the body. Fear doesn't just live in your thoughts and emotions. It takes up residence in your physical form. Every unexpressed worry finds a home in your shoulders. Every suppressed anxiety settles into your stomach. Every avoided truth creates tension in your jaw. Your body becomes a library of everything you haven't been willing to feel fully. This is why purely mental approaches to overcoming fear often fall short. You can understand intellectually that your fears are inherited and irrational. But if your nervous system is still running on high alert, if your muscles are still contracted from years of bracing for impact, if your breathing is still shallow from chronic anxiety, the fear continues to operate through your physical experience even when your mind knows better. Your body doesn't lie, and it doesn't forget. It remembers every time you held your breath when conflict arose. Every instance you clenched your stomach when facing uncertainty. Every moment you tightened your throat rather than speak your truth. These physical memories create a baseline of tension that can trigger fearful thinking even in perfectly safe situations. The beautiful thing is that your body is also incredibly responsive to conscious attention and care. When you learn to recognize where fear has taken up residence physically and address it with compassion, rather than resistance, profound shifts become possible. The chronic headaches that have plagued you for years might be holding unexpressed grief. The digestive issues that doctors can't quite explain might be connected to situations you haven't been able to stomach emotionally. Now, learning to read your body's language and respond to its needs becomes essential for complete transformation, because lasting change happens when mind, emotions, and physical form are all aligned in the same direction. Write in the comments, "My body remembers everything." The conversation your body has been trying to have with you is far more specific than you might realize. That chronic tightness in your neck and shoulders isn't just from poor posture or sleeping wrong. It's from carrying responsibilities that were never yours to carry. It's from holding up a world that doesn't actually need your constant support, from bracing yourself against criticisms that might never come, from shouldering burdens that belong to other people's choices and consequences. Your digestive system, meanwhile, has been working overtime trying to process not just food, but all the situations and emotions you haven't been able to stomach. That knot in your stomach during difficult conversations, the nausea when facing uncertainty, the way your appetite disappears when stress increases. Your gut is literally telling you about experiences you haven't fully digested emotionally. And that tightness in your chest, that feeling like you can't quite catch your breath even when nothing is physically wrong, that's your heart's way of expressing all the emotions you've been afraid to feel fully. It's the grief you never allowed yourself to process, the love you were too scared to express, the anger you convinced yourself was inappropriate, the joy you thought you didn't deserve. What's remarkable is how quickly these physical symptoms can shift when you finally acknowledge what they're trying to communicate. The moment you stop fighting your body's wisdom and start listening to it, transformation becomes possible at the cellular level. Your nervous system begins to relax because it's finally being heard. Your muscles release tension because they no longer need to hold your emotional truth hostage. This is why living without fear isn't about becoming reckless or impulsive. True freedom doesn't mean throwing caution to the wind or making decisions without consideration for consequences. That's not wisdom, that's reaction. That's fear of fear itself, which is just another form of the same problem. Authentic fearlessness looks completely different. It's characterized by an inner clarity that doesn't need external validation before taking action. It moves with deliberate intention rather than desperate urgency. It considers consequences without being paralyzed by them. It takes calculated risks based on internal guidance rather than external pressure or internal rebellion. The person who has genuinely transcended fear-based living doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, including themselves. They don't make decisions to impress others or to escape their current situation. They choose based on what feels most aligned with their authentic nature and highest potential. This creates a quality of movement through life that appears effortless from the outside, but is actually the result of deep inner work and conscious choice. The transformation from fear-based living to alignment-based living happens gradually through consistent practice of choosing expansion over contraction, truth over safety, growth over comfort. Each time you choose authenticity in a small moment, you build evidence for your nervous system that it's safe to show up more fully in bigger moments. Now, mastering this transition requires understanding the precise mechanics of how to consistently access this state of aligned clarity, especially during challenging situations when old patterns Want to reassert themselves? Write in the comments, I choose alignment over fear. The difference between fear-based caution and wisdom-based discernment is profound, though it can be subtle to recognize at first. When you operate from fear, every decision feels heavy, urgent, loaded with potential catastrophe. You're constantly asking, what if this goes wrong? And spending enormous amounts of mental energy trying to predict and prevent problems that may never materialize. Wisdom, on the other hand, moves with a completely different quality. It's not anxious about outcomes because it trusts in your ability to navigate whatever emerges. It doesn't need to control every variable because it knows that life unfolds intelligently, even when that intelligence isn't immediately apparent to your rational mind. Wisdom whispers rather than shouts, suggests rather than demands, guides rather than pushes. When you're connected to this inner wisdom, decision-making becomes almost effortless. You don't need to analyze every option to death or seek validation from 10 different people. You simply check in with your deeper knowing, and the right course of action reveals itself naturally. Sometimes that guidance says wait, sometimes it says move forward, sometimes it suggests a completely unexpected third option you hadn't considered. The fascinating thing is that this wisdom has been available to you all along. It's just been drowned out by the noise of fearful thinking. It's like trying to hear a quiet conversation in a room full of people shouting. The conversation is happening, but you can't access it until you turn down the volume on everything else. This is where transformation stops being theoretical and becomes practical. Once you understand the mechanics of how fear operates and recognize that wisdom is your natural state when fear isn't interfering, you need a reliable method for consistently accessing that wisdom, especially during challenging moments when old patterns are most likely to reassert themselves. The process begins with conscious observation, which sounds simple but requires genuine commitment. Most people live their entire lives without ever really looking directly at their fear. They feel it, react to it, organize their lives around avoiding it, but they never actually examine it closely enough to understand its structure and origins. You have to be willing to pause in the middle of a fearful reaction and ask, what exactly am I afraid of right now? This observation immediately creates space between you and the fear because you're no longer completely identified with it. You've stepped into the role of witness, which is already a more empowered position than being the victim of your own emotional reactions. From this place of conscious observation, you can begin to recognize the specific beliefs that are feeding the fear. Every fearful emotion is sustained by an underlying thought or assumption. Fear of rejection is based on the belief that your worth depends on others' approval. Fear of failure is rooted in the idea that making mistakes diminishes your value. Fear of loss assumes that your security comes from external circumstances. Now, understanding how to systematically dissolve these limiting beliefs and replace them with empowering truths that actually support your growth and authentic expression becomes the key to permanent transformation. Write in the comments, I'm ready for the method. Once you've identified the specific belief feeding your fear and connected with that deeper source of wisdom within yourself, you reach the most powerful part of the transformation process, the moment when you consciously choose to speak a new reality into existence. This isn't about positive affirmations or trying to convince yourself that everything is fine when it's not. This is about recognizing that the words you speak, especially when they come from a place of genuine conviction, have an extraordinary power to reshape your inner landscape. Every word carries energy. Every sentence plants seeds in the fertile ground of your subconscious mind. When you consistently speak from fear, describing what you're afraid might happen, elaborating on worst-case scenarios, reinforcing your limitations through casual conversation, you're literally programming your experience to match those words. Your nervous system responds to what you describe as if it were already happening. But when you flip this process and begin speaking from your highest understanding instead of your deepest fears, something remarkable occurs. Your words begin to create space for new possibilities to emerge. Instead of reinforcing old patterns, you're actively dissolving them through conscious speech that aligns with who you're becoming rather than who you've been. This isn't about pretending problems don't exist or putting on a false positive facade. It's about speaking from the part of you that knows your true capability, your essential strength, your fundamental worthiness. When you declare, "I am capable of handling whatever emerges," instead of, "I don't know what I'll do if something goes wrong," you're not denying reality. You're choosing to focus on the aspect of reality that empowers rather than diminishes you. The transformation happens because these conscious declarations literally evict the old thought patterns that have been squatting in your mind without permission. Fear maintains its grip through repetition, through the constant internal dialogue of worry, doubt, and limitation. But when you interrupt that dialogue with purposeful statements of truth, strength, and possibility, you're essentially changing the radio station in your own consciousness. What makes this particularly powerful is understanding that you're not trying to convince anyone else of these truths. You're reprogramming your own internal operating system. Every time you consciously choose to speak from wisdom rather than from fear, you're strengthening neural pathways associated with confidence, clarity, and creative problem-solving, while weakening the pathways associated with anxiety, self-doubt, and limitation. Now, taking this understanding and applying it consistently in real-world situations, especially during moments of stress or uncertainty when old patterns are most likely to reassert themselves, requires developing specific practices that anchor these new ways of thinking and speaking into your daily experience. Write in the comments, "My words create my world." The profound misunderstanding that keeps people trapped in cycles of fear is believing that the solution lies in becoming braver, stronger, more courageous. This approach treats fear like an enemy that needs to be defeated through force of will, through gritting your teeth and pushing through despite the terror. But courage, when it's based on human effort alone, is just another form of reaction. You're still operating from the premise that fear is real and powerful. You're just trying to overpower it. True transformation happens when you recognize that fear and love cannot coexist in the same space. They operate on completely different frequencies, like trying to tune into two radio stations simultaneously. When genuine love fills your consciousness, not romantic love, not emotional attachment, but that deeper sense of connection to something greater than your individual concerns, fear simply has nowhere to exist. This isn't about forcing yourself to feel love or trying to manufacture positive emotions. It's about recognizing that beneath all your learned fears, beneath all your protective strategies, beneath all your inherited anxieties, there's an unshakable foundation of belonging, worthiness, and connection that has never been threatened by any external circumstance. When you access this state, decision-making becomes completely different. You're no longer asking, "What's the safest choice?" or "What will protect me from potential pain?" Instead, you're asking, "What wants to emerge through this situation? And how can I serve the highest good here?" The shift is subtle but transformative. You've moved from a defensive posture to a creative one. People operating from this place of genuine love-based consciousness don't need endless reassurance before taking action. They don't require guarantees about outcomes. They don't spend weeks analyzing every possible scenario before making a move. There's an inner knowing that transcends logical analysis, a trust that runs deeper than evidence, a confidence that doesn't depend on external validation. This state of consciousness naturally expands your perception of what's possible because you're no longer filtering every opportunity through the lens of potential threat. You begin to notice synchronicities, connections, and possibilities that were invisible when you were operating from survival mode. The same situations that once triggered anxiety become gateways for creative expression and meaningful contribution. The most beautiful aspect of this transformation is how it affects everyone around you without you having to do anything to convince or change them. When you genuinely embody this frequency of love-based living, people feel it. They may not understand what's different about you, but they sense a quality of peace, authenticity, and presence that naturally invites their own authentic self to emerge. Now, learning to consistently access and maintain this state, especially during challenging situations when old patterns want to reassert themselves, requires understanding the specific practices that anchor this way of being into your daily reality. Write in the comments, "Love dissolves my fear." The most powerful tool for transforming your relationship with fear isn't avoidance or resistance, it's conscious blessing. This might sound counterintuitive, especially when we're talking about people, places, or situations that have caused you genuine pain or continue to trigger anxiety. But blessing isn't about condoning harmful behavior or pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. It's about reclaiming your energetic sovereignty. Every person who has ever triggered fear in you continues to live in your energy field until you consciously release the charge between you. That critical boss from 5 years ago still has hooks in your confidence whenever you face authority figures. That relationship that ended badly still influences how you approach intimacy. That friend who betrayed your trust still whispers doubt in your ear whenever you consider opening up to someone new. When you bless these people, not their actions but their essential being, you're performing an act of energetic surgery. You're cutting the invisible cords that have been draining your vitality and keeping you stuck in reactive patterns. You're essentially saying, "I release you from being the villain in my story, and I release myself from being the victim in yours." The transformation isn't about them changing or even knowing what you've done. It's about freeing yourself from the prison of resentment, fear, and defensive reactivity that keeps you small. When you genuinely bless someone who has hurt you, you often discover that the power you thought they had over you was actually power you had unconsciously given them through your continued emotional investment in the wound. Places hold similar energetic imprints, but they work differently. That hospital room where you received devastating news, that house where you experienced trauma, that workplace where you felt humiliated, these locations don't have actual power over you, but they function like tuning forks, activating memories and emotional states that you may have thought you'd moved beyond. When you return to these places in a state of blessing rather than bracing, something profound shifts. You're no longer the same person who was wounded there. You've grown, learned, developed resources and perspectives that weren't available to you during the original experience. By consciously blessing the place, you're updating your energetic relationship with that location and everything it represents. This practice extends to situations that repeatedly trigger fear: job interviews, difficult conversations, medical appointments, social gatherings. Instead of approaching these scenarios with dread and defensive strategies, you can bless them in advance, essentially programming yourself to show up from a place of wholeness rather than woundedness. Now, understanding how to extend this principle of blessing into every aspect of your daily life creates a foundation for living as a free soul rather than someone who is constantly managing and defending against potential threats. Write in the comments, "I choose to bless and release." When you've truly moved beyond fear-based living, the most noticeable change isn't dramatic. It's the absence of internal friction in your daily actions. You stop approaching each day like you're entering a battlefield that requires strategic defense. Instead, you move through your experiences with a quality of ease that might surprise people who knew you during your more anxious periods. This ease isn't about everything going perfectly or never encountering challenges. It's about not adding layers of unnecessary tension to whatever is actually happening. When you need to have a difficult conversation, you don't spend days rehearsing every possible response and building elaborate protective strategies. You simply show up present and speak your truth. When you face an uncertain situation, you don't exhaust yourself trying to control every variable. You engage with what's in front of you and trust your ability to navigate whatever emerges. People operating from this place make decisions with a quality of clarity that can seem almost mysterious to those still caught in analysis paralysis. They don't need to consult 15 people, research every option exhaustively, or wait for perfect conditions before taking action. They check in with their inner guidance, get clear on what feels most aligned, and move forward without the heavy burden of second-guessing that characterizes fear-based decision-making. Perhaps the most liberating aspect of this transformation is how guilt simply evaporates from your decision-making process. When fear governs your choices, every decision carries an undercurrent of what if I'm wrong, or what if I hurt someone, or what if this isn't the perfect choice. You live in a constant state of low-level anxiety about whether you're doing enough, choosing correctly, living up to everyone's expectations, including your own impossible standards. But when you're operating from authentic alignment rather than fearful protection, that internal critic loses its voice. You make choices based on what genuinely serves the highest good, including your own well-being, without the exhausting mental commentary about whether you deserve what you want or whether you're being selfish by honoring your authentic needs. This shift creates a ripple effect throughout your entire life experience. Your relationships become more genuine because you're not constantly editing yourself to avoid potential conflict. Your work becomes more fulfilling because you're choosing opportunities based on authentic interest rather than fear-based security. Your daily interactions carry less weight because you're not interpreting every exchange through the lens of potential judgment or rejection. Now, understanding how this state of being naturally impacts everyone around you and creates the conditions for living as a genuine expression of freedom, rather than someone who is constantly managing their image or protecting their position, becomes the foundation for authentic influence and contribution. Write in the comments, "I'm ready for this ease." The most profound shift that occurs when you've genuinely moved beyond fear-based living is the complete dissolution of that constant background hum of anxiety that most people consider normal. You know that feeling, the perpetual sense that something needs your attention, something might go wrong, something requires your vigilance, that mental energy that's always partially occupied with monitoring, planning, anticipating, controlling. When you truly understand that you're part of an intelligent universe that unfolds according to principles far more sophisticated than your individual mind can comprehend, anxiety becomes not just unnecessary, but actually counterproductive. You begin to trust that the right opportunities will present themselves at the right time, that the relationships meant for you will find their way into your life, that the challenges you face are perfectly designed to help you grow in exactly the ways you need to grow. This isn't passive resignation or spiritual bypassing, where you use faith as an excuse to avoid responsibility. It's the recognition that there's a difference between taking appropriate action from a place of clarity and trying to force outcomes through anxious manipulation of circumstances. You still engage fully with your life, but you're no longer exhausting yourself trying to control variables that were never yours to control in the first place. People who have made this transition often describe feeling like they're finally swimming with the current instead of against it. Doors open more easily, conversations flow more naturally, solutions appear more readily, not because their circumstances have become perfect, but because they're no longer creating resistance through anxious interference with natural processes. What emerges from this state of inner freedom is perhaps the most powerful form of influence possible: wordless testimony. You become living proof that a different way of being human is possible. You don't need to convince anyone, teach anyone, or explain your transformation to anyone. Your presence itself becomes a permission slip for others to remember their own capacity for peace, authenticity, and fearless living. This kind of influence operates completely below the radar of conscious awareness. People spend time with you and leave feeling somehow more hopeful, more calm, more connected to their own inner wisdom without being able to explain why. Children and animals gravitate toward you naturally because they sense the absence of that fearful energy that makes most adults feel somewhat threatening or unpredictable. You discover that authentic transformation has never been about perfecting yourself or achieving some ideal state. It's about releasing the layers of conditioning that were covering up who you already were. When fear is no longer running the show, what emerges is simply your natural state: present, responsive, creative, loving, free. Now, understanding how to maintain this state consistently and share its benefits with the world around you requires recognizing the specific practices and perspectives that keep you anchored in this frequency of authentic freedom. Write in the comments, "I am becoming free." If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, from fear to freedom, you're already demonstrating the exact quality we've been talking about: the willingness to sit with transformative ideas, even when they challenge everything you've been taught about how life is supposed to work. This conversation we've been having isn't just theoretical. Every insight you've absorbed, every moment of recognition you've felt, every time you thought, "That's exactly what I've been experiencing," those are seeds of actual change taking root in your consciousness right now. You wouldn't have been drawn to spend this time with these ideas if some part of you wasn't already ready to live differently. The content I create here is specifically for people who are done living small, who are tired of letting inherited fears make their decisions, who want to remember what it feels like to move through the world with authentic confidence rather than anxious protection. If that resonates with you, subscribing means you'll have consistent access to perspectives and practices that support this ongoing transformation. If this message found you at exactly the right moment, if these words felt like they were speaking directly to your situation, write in the comments, "This message was meant for me." I read every single comment, and there's something powerful about declaring your readiness for change, even in a simple phrase. And if you felt that sense of connection throughout our time together, that feeling of finally hearing someone articulate what you've been sensing but couldn't quite put into words, hitting the like button tells me this kind of content is serving you. It helps me understand what's most valuable to create more of. There's a video right here that goes even deeper into the practical aspects of living this way daily. Click and continue with me over there, because this journey we're on together is just getting started.